For our regular attenders, you will know that last week we brought to a conclusion our previous sermon series focusing on the Ten Commandments and how even as saved sinners living in the light of God's Christ resurrected glory, we are still called to live according to his standards. We brought that series to an end, and now that leaves the question, well, what's next? And this morning we're going to begin a new sermon series on the book of Genesis, at least the first 11 chapters of that book. The word Genesis means origins, where things come from. And I've always marveled at the fact that Genesis does such an incredible job of still being relevant today. That even though it explains things that happened thousands and thousands of years ago and was written thousands and thousands of years ago, it is still so very practical for our understanding of who am I? Why am I here? Who is God? How do I relate to God? How do I handle sin? And how am I supposed to handle it? And so much of this is in Genesis, and I've wanted to do this sermon series for a long time, but quite frankly been somewhat intimidated by the breadth of study that needs to go into such a book. But we're going to start that series today with the idea of understanding often. How does what this will reveal to us about the origins of things continue to speak into our lives this very day? And so where do we start? We start at the very beginning. We'll be looking at just the first three verses, and quite frankly, the first verse of Genesis chapter 1. It's Pew Bible page number 1, starting at the beginning. So open up into the very beginning, and we'll read just the first few verses of the book of Genesis. Genesis starts by saying, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, the truth of the matter is that Genesis, when you do study it, gets controversial, and it gets very controversial from the very beginning. Those very first few words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," raise up red flags for a whole lot of people. And it's always done that, to be honest. Even the original readers and audience of this text would have found these words controversial, but for different reasons than most of us. In the original audience, it was pretty much assumed that God created, that we are creatures, that creation was how we came into existence. It wasn't how we were made or come into a being, but who that was controversial. And where many different groups had ideas about a whole group of gods that came together and created humans because they needed help in their work, or were punishing other gods, or were trying to impose their power upon things, or just wanted to make fun and merry, they made these things called people to exist. Genesis speaks against that and says, no. The creation that we see was made by one true God. That he created by his own power, and he created out of nothing. And that stood out as an amazing proclamation against those polytheistic religions of the day. But while that's acceptable for them and challenging for them, we all know that the area where we find these statements, this first verse controversial, is not necessarily in the who, but the how. And the idea of creation being the foundation of everything exists in our culture is pretty much dismissed as something that should go into the scrap heap of history. That anyone that continues to think that we need to posit a God, an eternal being that lays behind everything that exists, well, those people are foolish and simple-minded. Haven't you heard, don't you know? no. That is an old idea that has been explained away now by science. And science is a story that replaces the story that Genesis tells. And in particular, that evolution is a much better explanation for where we came from than the story of Genesis. And so for the sake of this morning, I figured that I needed to confront that issue head on. To look at that discussion that is so permeated our society. Is creation just an old thought that needs to be dismissed and embrace the idea of evolution, or does evolution have its own struggles? And I hope this morning to simply fortify those who have been called foolish and simple-minded when they proclaim that they continue to believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, against those that say that that's a foolish, simple-minded belief. Being rather simplistic, the theory of evolution was primarily put forth in science by the guy named Charles Darwin. Darwin, in his observations and travels around the world, noticed the slight variations in animals that were of the same species and yet looked different. And so, for example, when you found a certain kind of tortoise in the shape of its shell, you were able to identify what island that tortoise was from. Or certain birds that had longer and narrower beaks in one part of the world, but shorter and stubbier beaks in another part of an island or the world, based on the food that was more readily available in those areas. And what he learned, and positive, is absolutely true. Over time, animals do adapt and adjust physically to fit their surroundings and environment. And this adaptation is properly called evolution. Christians believe that evolution with a small e does take place. We can see that in animals in different environments, recognizing that elephants that live in Africa look different from elephants that live in Asia. Many of you in the dairy industry know that you intentionally try to manipulate the genetics so that you get cows that produce the maximum amount of milk. We do this with our almond crops. We do this with our corn. We understand that in environment and through modifications, certain species can adapt and adjust and evolve. Again, with the lowercase e. However, and again, admitting we're being overly simplistic here, what Darwin did was to begin to posit the idea that when you see all of these little adaptations and start to add them up over very long periods of time, what you find is that this is an explanation for everything that lives. That all that we see in the living world, from plants and animals, all goes back to a single collective or a couple of singular sources. And from those common sources, all of life, over great periods of time, minor adjustment by minor adjustment, has allowed us to see everything that exists. This is what we would call capital E evolution. The idea that all of life originated from similar sources, and evolution can explain what we see today, where everything came from, and how we have the variety in the world that we do. And in short, this has become an accepted teaching of science that God did not create the way that is explained in Genesis and speaks of, but that evolution is a far better explanation for where we came from, and why we are the way that we are, and why other living things are the way that they are. Now, while diving into this issue, there's a couple of precursors that I want to make sure that we put out there. First of all, this is an issue that has been long debated and discussed over the last 150 years. People far smarter than myself have written volumes on this. Many debates have taken place. But in that discussion, let me make abundantly clear, you can't draw a simple line that a lot of people like to do and say, everyone who is very intelligent is on this side of the argument, and all of the dumb, simplistic, foolish people are on this side of the argument. No. There are very intelligent people who have gone to the best of schools, who study this stuff intently and deeply, who are up to date on the latest of all of these things, and continue to believe in creation, the story of Genesis. So be aware of that. Now, having said that, I have to also admit that for many of us on the more simplistic side of things, who aren't quite as intelligent as those brainy people, that we kind of straw man the other side using simplistic arguments. Oh, well, to believe in creation, that means that you're just ignoring all of science. You don't believe in science at all. And of course, how do you not believe in science? So you're just dismissed. And we can do that on both sides. Rather simplistic ways of fighting against not what people really believe. I don't want to do that this morning. But what I would like to try to do this morning is to spend a little bit of time explaining why I don't think that the theory of evolution with a capital E is a sufficient explanation for the origins of everything that exists. And certainly not so compelling that it forces us to throw away what Genesis 1 says in order to embrace that theory instead. Now, while there's a lot of things that could be said in this and the volumes of stuff that have been written, I wanted to just boil it down to 4 issues this morning that I personally have found compelling as an argument for creation over evolution. The first one is not controversial, but it needs to be pointed out. The theory of evolution is an attempt to explain the origin and diversity of all living things. But inherent in that attempt is an admitted limitation. It cannot account for the origins of everything else that is non-biological. Evolution is under the umbrella of biology in science. It is the study of life, and as such, it has nothing to say about where other things come from. Why do we have different types of rock? And where do rocks come from? And for that matter, why is there so much water on this planet? And where does water come from? And other things like planets and the suns, all of those things that need to exist in order for life to be maintained. Where did that come from? And again, because evolution is a biological science, it can't answer those questions. It's not equipped to tell us how that stuff came into being and into existence. Now, they'll go to other sciences to be sure, but it's inadequate in explaining those things, and more is needed. And as soon as we talk about other non-living material, it also can't explain the non-physical that we see in our world. When we talk about humans as we are, they can't explain, well, where does the soul come from? Why does this accidental collection and masses of cells that have clung together in just such this way, why can I feel jealousy or show love? Where does my morality and a sense of conscience come from? And again, evolutionary biologists, because of their field, they have no explanation for that. They can only deal with what is physical and seen. So simply put, evolution can't and doesn't even try to explain the origins of anything that is non-biological. And in not being able to address this issue, it falls short in being an adequate explanation for everything that exists. The second argument that I'm going to make by way of an illustration. So several years ago, I happened to stumble upon this television show called Inside Nature's Giants. It's a British documentary show that scientists would come across these great animals that were dead in the field, and then there on television they would dissect those animals. Hippopotamuses and whales and giraffes and large snakes and sharks, and they would talk about what makes that animal unique and some of the unique anatomical features that allows that animal to be the animal that it is. And in reality, it is a very pro-evolution series. In fact, the host of the series is a man named Richard Dawkins, who is a renowned, adamant atheist who is very antagonistic to anyone who believes in the faith. And so the whole point of this show is to credit evolution and to use evolution to explain how these animals have these unique features. Well, one of the episodes that I watched was an episode that looked at a sea turtle. And when dissecting the sea turtle, they pointed out something really interesting. And that's the fact that with all other turtles, the shell of a sea turtle is actually its rib cage. That when you pull out all of the guts and you get to the back of the shell, as you can see in the picture behind me, there in the back of a turtle is its vertebrae and then its ribs that harden together to create the shell, which is a pretty incredible thing to notice. However, therein lies an evolutionary problem. In all other animals, the shoulder blades of the animal are found on the outside of our rib cages. However, in turtles, including the sea turtle, the shoulder blades are found on the inside of the animal's shoulder blades. And as the show itself said, there is a real puzzle as to how they managed to get the shoulder blades inside of the ribs. And they call it one of evolution's greatest riddles, because it's almost impossible to imagine how, in a series of tiny adjustments, you get one animal with shoulder blades on the outside of its rib cage to give birth to an animal with shoulder blades inside of its rib cage. And what they call a puzzle of evolution, I would call scientific evidence that challenges your theory. And again, that particular example is told to illustrate a greater point and problem of Darwin's theories. His idea is built on the idea that everything came from a common ancestors and then adapted and changed over time. However, when we look at the fossil record, we don't find that. We don't find a whole lot of bones and fossils of things that are on their way to becoming something different. We find fossils and bones that look like giraffes and are identifiable as whales and as wolves. We don't see a lot of things becoming those things. So you may have heard of a missing link. Well, the reality is there are thousands and thousands and millions of missing links in the fossil record. Now, my understanding is that Darwin was aware of this. And yet, his understanding was, well, we just hadn't found the fossils yet. We hadn't dug in the right places, we haven't looked in the right areas, and eventually, as time would go on, we would find more and more of these missing links. But time hasn't changed. In fact, as we find more and more fossils, the reality is that most animals appear at the same time in forms pretty much that are identifiable and look like they do today. And there is so much in the fossil record that's missing. And so the second argument is that when evolution posits all of these slow changes throughout a very long period of time, there are many changes that cannot be explained, and there are many changes that they must posit that we have no evidence for having taken place. And therefore, once again, I found it wanting and needing. A third issue is actually one that Darwin didn't know quite as well as we do today, and that's the microbiology's role in evolution. Today we've learned a lot more about what makes a living thing how it is. And that's the DNA of any particular living thing. How those strands of tiny little proteins come together in just such a way that ensures that any human being has 2 legs where they're supposed to be, eyes where they're supposed to be, and then affects the thickness of their hair, the color of their skin, the color of their eyes, and their height. All of that is encoded in the DNA. Now, when you try to go back to the beginning and think about evolution explaining our origin, and you incorporate these ideas of microbiology and DNA, you run into some problems. First of all, DNA is just information. And so in order for that information to be useful, you have to have both the information and the things that can interpret what that information means in order to start the process by which a living creature is made. So I've got in my hand one of these nice USB drives. There's a lot of information on this drive. And this particular one, I've got probably about 600 of the sermons that I've written, as well as some PowerPoint presentations and pictures, all contained on this tiny little thing. But in order for this to be useful, you need a computer that is acceptable of this drive and can properly interpret the information that is on this drive. If you just have this drive, or were you to go back in history even 20 years and gave this to somebody, they would have no idea what to do with it, and they would have no way of getting all of the information that's found on it. Well, the same is true of DNA. That the information found in those molecules is just information if there's nothing to interpret it. And you have to suggest that both of those things happened to have come together at just the right time, where what could read the information, what contained the information, in order for life to even begin. But then it gets more complicated when you try to think about the mutations that are necessary for that to change. And it's hard to imagine that usable DNA just happened, or that the necessary changes in DNA all just occurred by chance, the way that evolution claims. So this is where I have to admit I'm getting a little even over my own head, but in the research that I did, let me just explain that DNA is made up of protein. A modest chain of those proteins is about 150 links long. The average in a living thing is 250 links long. And each one of those links in that chain is made up of one of 20 different types of amino acids. And so, in order for a living thing to exist or come into existence, a chain of 150 links long have to come together in just the right order. So when you start to put all of that together, what has to be suggested is that all of those amino acids randomly came together in just the right way to create a usable strand of DNA. Well, when you think about that, when you take those 20 different amino acids and you think that it has to come together in a strand of 150 links long, the scientists and mathematicians say that there are roughly, therefore, 10 to the power of 195 possibilities of putting those 20 amino acids together in just 150 long link chain, which is pretty incredible of a number when you think that, according to the same thing I read, that there are only 10 to the 80th power number of atoms in the universe. Now, of all of those different possible combinations, only one in 10 to the 74th power would actually create something usable and make life. And given the fact that we know that even minor variations in DNA cause mutations that destroy the living thing and don't even allow it to move forward, when you look at this and try to credit to it as chance all of the mutations that are necessary to move evolution forward, the likelihood is basically zero. There is really no way that chance can explain all of those variations just happening to come together in such a way that a creature that had no sight suddenly gives birth to a creature that can experience sight. And then that creature, at just the right time, finds a suitable mate so that they can create another one to carry on. The ability to experience light moves forward. That is virtually impossible. One of my little hobbies every once in a while is to learn a new card trick. And a typical card trick is, choose a card, remember it, put it back in the deck, and then do different ways. You go, and was this your card? And they say, yeah, wow. And then the inevitable question is, well, how did you do that? And if my answer was, I got lucky. I had a 1 in 52 shot that your card would be found. Those odds aren't all that incredible, and there it is, I did it. They would never say, oh, well, that was pretty cool. You did get lucky. That's a completely acceptable answer. No, they would say, no, I don't buy that. You must have done something to manipulate it. Something must have controlled that to make you find the right card. Well, if that's how we think about a 1 in 52 shot of something happen, why would we ever posit that something with a 1 in 10 to the 74th power would have a possibility and say, oh, well, that is a good explanation for how we got the things that we have. And so on a microbiological level, once again, the more we learn about how DNA works, the harder that it is to suggest that meaningful changes occurred and can be credited through evolution. Fourth, and the last argument that I want to highlight for this morning, though, again, there's certainly more, is the idea that science keeps on changing. A while ago, I overheard a conversation where a young man said to somebody else, he goes, I don't believe in religion, I believe in science. And I had kind of wanted to, and I wish I would have, asked the question, well, science of what year? Because the reality is that what scientists believe today often gets corrected in the record later on. What is known as a fact and proclaimed as a fact today often gets gone back to and said, well, actually, we weren't quite so right about that. Now, scientists would say that's a good thing, and it is. We want to understand the world properly more, and where corrections need to be made, we should be able to make them. However, the problem becomes when someone in this particular moment says to somebody else, you need to give up on the idea of creation because this truth proves evolution. And someone looks at that, accepts it as truth, and that's the truth, the thing that gets them to throw away the idea of creationism, only to find out later that scientists have actually dismissed that as a believable truth any longer. And now we have a person that has thrown away their faith because of something that they were told was a fact, which no longer is believed in or agreed upon. And so the reality is that science also takes faith. Science is constantly going back and correcting the things that they believed, and in doing so, a lot of once was taught as proof for evolution especially is now dismissed and discarded, and they have readjusted their interpretations, and to surrender your faith because of that becomes a major problem. Now, like I said, I could go on, and I hope that this has been a brief overview that has made some sense. However, now let me try to quickly answer the question that I said we would address every time. Practically, what difference does it really make? Why does it matter? Can't we just say, well, you say this, we say that. No one can ever really know because nobody was really there, so what difference does it make? And for us, living in the world today, there are some significant impacts to whether we agree on creation and the story of Genesis or buy into the theory of capital E evolution as a source for all living things. The first implication is spelled out in our understanding of the Bible. Is this book trustworthy or not? Can this be the source that we go to for reliable information about where we come from and who God is and how he calls us to live? Or from the very start, do we need to question and criticize and pull this book apart as unreliable, as myth that can be dismissed, as pages that can be torn out and thrown away, and other pages accepted? And if our starting point at the very beginning of this book is to say, well, I don't like that, or that's not trustworthy, set you up for a very dangerous precedent for the rest of this book. If this book can't be trusted in Genesis, can it still be trusted when it talks about other things, about who you are, who God is, and how you are called to live? And so your belief in creation versus evolution often boils down to what is your understanding of this book? Again, both require faith. The second area that it has implications for is your understanding of yourself, of us, of ourselves. Next week, we're going to read the rest of Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to see how Genesis tells the story of how you, as a creation of God, are made in his image. And therefore, he made you for a purpose and with meaning, with something to do in this life. He has sent you on a mission. He designed you the way you are for a particular reason. But if you take the theory of evolution and buy into that, again, as a capital E, well, then who are we? And why are we here? In the end, I see that leading to only one of two roads. You either follow the road that leads to despair that basically says, well, I'm nothing except a random accident of time and history. There is no purpose for me to be here. I just happen to exist because the right molecules bump together at just the right time, and voila, millions of years later, here I am. But I've got no purpose or meaning, and it can lead to despair. The other avenue is to lead basically to pride. Well, if God doesn't exist and he doesn't tell me why I'm living this way, then I am my own God, and I get to decide why I'm here. I get to look at you as other accidents of history, and I can use you and abuse you in order to elevate myself, because there's no greater force or being outside of just the accidents of history that controls this. There is no morality. Therefore, I can be my own God. And again, the story of Genesis is greatly different from this. And where you fall on this understanding makes a huge difference in how you understand yourself. And then finally, it has major implications, obviously, for your understanding of who God is. Now, granted, most evolutionary atheists are exactly that. They dismiss God altogether from the picture, and a lot of the reason why evolution has been promoted and pushed forward is because it wants to be an alternative story to creation, to dismiss the divine from having to control everything altogether. However, even if you are one of those many people out there that wants to say, well, I still believe in God, but I want to say that the evolution is the process by which God brought about everything that exists, there's implications in that as well. Was the God that created a God that just kind of made all of this stuff, put it in the right container, and then stepped back and watched it unfold of its own chance and design? Or, as Genesis tells, was God intimately and carefully involved in every step of the process? Was he designing and shaping and assigning roles within his creation all along the way? Which means for us today, is God a God that just kind of stands back and watches your world unfold haphazardly and by chance, not really wanting to step in unless he absolutely needs to? Or is he a God that's intimately involved in every detail of your life, that has a plan for you and is organizing things in such a way to turn you into the person he's calling you to be? It's an awful lot of information on there. I don't know if you're hearing with encouragement or skepticism, It's different from most sermons that I preach, but I thought it was an issue that had to be addressed and acknowledged from the very start. And again, my hope is, especially for those of you that may go off and feel that incredible pressure of society, you're a fool for continuing to believe in creationism. Haven't you understood that evolution has dismissed all of that? To encourage you to say, don't surrender. You don't have to give up on that. There's a lot in the scientific community that continues to say evolution doesn't answer all of the questions that it claims to answer. And so hold on to the truth of creationism. Hold on to the reality that God has revealed in an incredible way, the way that he made everything that exists. Well, we'll continue to look at that next week as we fill out the rest of chapter 1. But for now, let's join in a word of prayer. Lord God and Heavenly Father, we start with all of creation and marvel at the world that exists. We look at the diversity of plants and animals, of ecosystems, and even the diversity that's celebrated among us ourselves and how we are each unique creatures, and we just marvel at you who stand behind all of that. Lord, we live in a world that pressures us to surrender the words of your revelation, that challenges us to try to defeat or defend what they see as ignorant. And I pray that we would. I pray that having looked at some of this and continuing to look into this topic, that we would be fortified in trusting that you are a God who we can rely upon, a God who does have a plan and a purpose for that which he created, which includes us. So may we worship you and glorify you as the God that you are and serve you as you have made us to serve you. All this we pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen.